Well, it's an absolute delight to be here. I just been so impressed with the folks that I've met so far, the campus, the sense of community, and just looking at the Fred Rogers exhibit brought back so many memories. So thank you so much for this invitation, and all of you, Mark and Mike in particular, who made this happen. So I want to talk about the topic of framing with you today. I've written 2 books on the subject. My first one was in 1996 when it really wasn't talked about as a skill for practicing managers and leaders. But by 2011, it had become a very popular topic, and in general, we're getting a fair amount of use of the language of framing in everyday political discourse and work discourse, and so I want to unpack that a little bit. And let me begin by telling you a little story that begins to get at this, and this is a story that the American writer David Foster Wallace told at Kenyon College for their commencement address. And it's the story of 2 young fish that were swimming one day, and they happened past an older fish who looks at them and says, "Morning, boys, and how's the water?" And the 2 young fish swim past this older fish, and a few minutes later, one looks at the other and says, "What the hell is water?" It's a great story in the sense that it gets at how we take our environment, in particular our communication, for granted. And so many practicing managers, and those of you I know are going to be graduating and going into that position, are no different. You think that if I'm talking, I must be communicating, when in fact that's not necessarily the case. So let me just ask you what your definition of communication is. In most cases, we see folks have a kind of simplistic view of communication as information transmission, right? It's almost like a hypodermic needle that you inject into the audience, right? Your message, and it's being transmitted from one to the other. You might also have a more authoritarian view of this, where you think, you know, what something means is what your boss tells you what it means, or your professor tells you what it means. But what I want to do is suggest something that is more meaning-centered. How do we think of communication as the creation of meaning? And I really like this quote by Lou Pondy way back in 1978. He said, the dual capacity to make sense of things and to put them into language meaningful to large numbers of people gives the person who has it enormous leverage. Framing, therefore, involves the ability to shape meaning, to choose one particular meaning over another when we communicate. Let's just talk about that for a moment, to choose one particular meaning over another when we communicate. Let's say that I showed up to this lecture, and as soon as Mike introduced me, I started speaking Pig Latin. What would you guys do? Just shout out, what would you do?
Laugh.
You might laugh, okay. So now we're sort of 5 minutes and I'm still speaking Pig Latin. What would you do? What's that? Try to translate, that might be one thing. There's something else you'd be doing. What's that? Say it louder.
Being so confused, you leave.
Okay, I bet you wouldn't leave.
Well, I'd be confused though.
You'd be confused, right? No, but this would be pretty bizarre, would it not?
Yeah.
She's speaking Pig Latin. There's something, you're missing something. What would you be doing? So you're being confused, you know, you're thinking about leaving, but you're doing something else. Are you not whispering to one another? Right? And what are you saying? WTF, maybe? Right? Or is she losing her mind? Right? Or is she pulling our leg? But notice the implications of that, right? The implications. If you decide that I'm pulling your leg, then maybe you give me 5 minutes, and then you go. But if you think I'm having a breakdown, then what do? it's sort of like a car accident, right? You can't look away from that. And you essentially, look to somebody, maybe look to Mike, or, look to the dean or what have you, and say, have someone come up and say, "It's okay, Gail, we're going to take you to the car now." Right? What have we done here, right? We have an ambiguous set of circumstances. I'm speaking Pig Latin. What you've done collectively, as you whisper and you look to various people, who are in the know, to assign meaning to my behavior. If you have assigned meaning that she's pulling her leg, you get up and leave in a couple of minutes. If you assign meaning, oh, she's having a breakdown, your behavior is very different. So framing is critical, and we do it together because we construct one reality over another. Okay? So let's talk a little bit about who has not been doing some very good framing these days. Mark Zuckerberg, huh? You know why? Well, he's been doing a lot of apologizing. If you look at how he has appeared in the news for the past couple of years, whether it's been Cambridge Analytica or the Russian, the involvement of Russians in our election, he's been doing an awful lot of apologizing, and that's been his sort of predominant media image of late, so much so that a great many commentators are talking about that. What's interesting about it is that when you look at what an apology should be like, one of the things that we know is that any well-crafted apology must claim responsibility for the transgression and not attribute one's actions to perhaps happenstance or external factors. And that is in fact what Zuckerberg has been doing. Related to Cambridge Analytica, he said, "I'm really sorry that this happened." Related to Russia's meddling in the 2016 election, he says, "For the ways my work was used to divide people rather than bring us together." There's a use of a passive voice here that suggests that he has little control over the ways in which his work was used by others. Now, I want you to contrast that with, for example, Starbucks CEO Kevin Johnson in April 2018, in which he gave an apology that took real ownership for two African-American men who were arrested while waiting for a friend at one of the stores. He said, "These two gentlemen did not deserve what happened, and we are accountable. I am accountable." So framing is a hugely important skill that a lot of times we don't have a lot of control over in terms of how people look at us, but it's a hugely important skill that we need to try to master regardless of the field that you're in. Whether it's engineering or the business or whether it's the humanities, the social sciences, we present ourselves as communicators, and understanding something about the framing process is absolutely critical. So let's kind of find out where you are on the scale in terms of how sensitive you might be to framing as a skill. There's been about 25 years of research done by Barbara J. O'Keefe, who's Dean of the College of Communication at Northwestern. And she has developed a program of research that really looks at how sensitive people are to the framing process. And there's one of three, these are three that I'm going to describe for you, and you can decide which one you are: an expressive, a conventional, or a strategic. So are we ready? All right? I'm not going to ask you to raise hands just to say who you are, but you would know. All right, the expressive. An interesting image. An expressive lacks an edit function. Do you know people like this? I see you laughing, right? People who just seem to not be able to control what they say. We find ourselves laughing, or we find ourselves being horrified. Sometimes it just comes out, right? And these folks tend to be least sensitive to framing as a skill. Their primary goal is simply to express themselves and react to others. So they don't really think about language a whole lot, because language is just a mere vehicle for expressing themselves. And messages are only edited when negative consequences are readily apparent. Now, do you know what a possible upside is to being an expressive? Anybody want to take a guess? A possible upside? Yes?
Everyone knows what you're thinking.
And so what? Oftentimes, people feel like they can be more trustworthy, right? Because they're not playing games. They tell you what they think of you, even though you're horrified by it. They know that they're telling them the truth, right? Yeah. So sometimes an expressive, in fact, often appears more trustworthy. Well, can you think of anybody in the public arena who tends to be an expressive? Even if you're a strong Trump supporter, and a lot of the research suggests that a great many that support Trump really wish he would not tweet quite so much. I think this past weekend it was a tweet storm like no other. It was approaching 50, did I hear? The interesting thing is, they said it took 10 years to find out what Richard Nixon thought about things, based on the tapes that were revealed. But Trump does not appear to have an unexpressed thought, right? Here's an example of one. But we've got others. Joe Biden, our former vice president and maybe presidential candidate, he's also an expressive. He has actually gotten in trouble and tanked his previous 2 presidential campaigns with things that he has said. Roseanne Barr, she lost her television show, would be a great example of one. Ted Turner, who is the founder of CNN, his nickname was Mouth from the South because he lacked that edit function. Bobby Knight, you know who he is? Former basketball coach, known for throwing chairs, collaring players, and what have you. Okay, so that's the expressive. If you ask an expressive, why did you say what you says? The expressive says, well, that's what I was thinking. Now, we have a second style who's called the conventional. If you ask a conventional, why did you say what you said? The conventional says, well, that's what's appropriate. That's what's appropriate. Okay, so the conventional sees the communication process as a cooperative game to be played. It's governed by certain social rules and you try to follow those. All right, so you're sitting at the table and you say, are those the potatoes? An expressive would say, well, yes, they are. A conventional would say what? Would you like the potatoes? Right? They see that as an indirect request. And because you're a conventional, right, you are essentially cooperating in that social custom and in that game. Not game in a game-playing sense, but essentially a language game, if you will. So language for the conventional involves expression in terms of the social effects one wants to achieve rather than the thoughts one has. The possible upside is that you have a good sensitivity to framing. The possible downside, and I'm going to talk about this in just a moment, but you're merely reactive to the context. All right? So let's go and give a couple of examples. Most managers are conventionals. In fact, if I did ask you to raise your hand, you would probably be a conventional. Okay, if I did, relative to the other 2. Bill Gates, have you heard him speak? Right? No one would accuse him of being a charismatic leader, right? But visionary, yes, but probably a conventional communicator. Hillary Clinton, 2016 presidential candidate, former Secretary of State, indeed a conventional communicator. Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook would be examples of other conventionals. All right, let's contrast that with the strategic. So what do you see in this picture? You see an old man, right, who's walking. That's what a conventional sees. A strategic does not see the context as fixed, but the context from multiple angles. And if you can see the context from multiple angles, you can see it as open to shaping. Okay? So, with strategics, people and situations are not fixed, rather they are created and negotiated through language. In difficult situations, the context and the situations are redefined to be appropriate. A great example of this, I was doing a leadership seminar in southern Utah, and we were in a lodge that was pretty beat up, and but still very nice for the area. And somebody came down after being assigned to their room, and they say, my carpets, there's stains all over my carpets. And the guy who was at the front desk, not exactly an employee, probably a family member, says, yeah, mine are the same way. Right? It completely nullified that situation because he understood that situation in a way that perhaps a customer service agent who had a more conventional style would not. Here's the thing about strategics, is that they have a heightened sensitivity to language. They dwell on issues of language, they play with language, they understand that language has power and that the words that you use really matter. And so the strategic focuses heavily on that. If you look at our presidents in our history, Abe Lincoln, Ronald Reagan, if you look at Martin Luther King, they were all not only eloquent speakers, but wordsmithers. That is, they really spent a lot of time looking for just the right language. And so one of the things that you all can be doing as you use your various technologies, as you communicate with one another, as you read literature or you read whatever it is you do, is just have that momentary reflection about what language is doing at that moment. And that has an impact in ways that you may be unaware. What do you think is the potential downside to being a strategic? Anyone want to take a guess? A downside. Maybe I'll give you an example. Bill Clinton, during the Monica Lewinsky deposition, was quoted as saying, "It depends on what the meaning of the word is." Do you think he was skewered by late night TV for that statement? Yeah. One of the downsides is that they can be seen as manipulative, right? So that if you have such a way with language that you can spin circles around people, right? People tend not to trust that. And so the goal is, as you develop your own communication style to try to become more strategic, is to do it with a sense of ethics, a sense of responsibility, a sense of the values that I think St. Vincent is teaching you, right? So critical, because if you cross that line to be a strategic who is perceived to manipulate, right, you've lost your audience. So here are some examples. Bill Clinton was one, clearly. Many people who have studied him marveled at the fact that he could be in a room with Republicans and Democrats and have everyone eating out of his hand within 5 minutes. He had that kind of way with the room, and a way that unfortunately his wife did not. Martin Luther King Jr. certainly was a strategic. Steve Jobs, a strategic. Oprah Winfrey, did anyone see her Golden Globe speech from 2 years ago? Yeah, they wanted her to run for president, right? Immediately after that, a great example of a strategic. So let me talk a little bit about some things to keep in mind about being a strategic. Effective framing from a strategic point of view is the ability to define the situation here and now in ways that connect with others. What I'd like to do is to show you just a little clip of Bob Murray, who is CEO of Murray Energy Corporation. And here is a guy who had a tragic accident in a mountain where there was coal mining in Utah in 2007. 6 miners were buried. And the debate at the time was why. It was because of retreat mining, as it later turned out. Bob Murray, however, was claiming that it was an earthquake. And so this was his very first news conference in which family members and the press were present. And I want to show you a clip from that conference, and I want you to tell me whether you think he connected with others. Let's see if I can get this.
And heard what I said then. I'll repeat some of that so that you have the complete picture. As I said, my name is Bob Murray. I'm the founder chairman president of a company called Murray Energy Corporation. I built a company from starting with a mortgage home. The United States of America is a great country. And today we have 3,300 employees in 5 states. We produce a product that is essential to the standard of living of every American, because our coal produces 52% of the energy in America today, and it is the lowest cost energy, costing 1/3 to 1/4 the cost of energy from natural gas, nuclear, and renewable resources. And without coal to manufacture our electricity, our products will not compete in the global marketplace against foreign countries, because our manufacturers depend on low-cost electricity, and people on fixed incomes will not be able to pay their electric bills. And every one of these global warming bills that has been introduced in Congress today eliminates the coal industry and will increase your electric rates 4 to 5-fold. So we are an essential industry.
Okay. Did he connect?
No.
Why not? Why not? First news conference, right? You know people that were in the mine, or you have a family member that was in the mine, or you're part of the press corps to cover that. And what's he talking about?
How essential his company was.
Exactly, right? Exactly. And so that is what a strategic understands, is how do you connect, right? How do you make that happen? And so we see a lot of cases where we see that disconnect, and as a result of that, reputations are lost. Through framing, we co-create the realities to which we then must respond. As I indicated earlier, you know, if I show up speaking Pig Latin, right, you have to figure out together, what does this mean? Together, you co-create meaning for the situation, and your action stems specifically from the meaning that you decide upon. Okay? So that's another key aspect. Here's the thing about how framing and communication link for leadership. It's oftentimes the ambiguity of the situation here and now that opens up the situation for interpretation. And that's an opportunity for leadership to emerge. Now, if you take a look at how leaders emerge in small group interaction or team interactions, the research says speak early and often. But it doesn't get at the content of their communication. And the content of their communication is about figuring out what's the situation here and now. When you think about it, the individuals to whom you look to in ambiguous or uncertain situations are those to whom you look to lead. And so if you can get a sense about, all right, how is it I formulate this for my team? How is it that I figure this out in a way that's understandable, in a way that's sensible? Individuals begin attributing leadership to you. Okay? So let's talk about a couple of techniques for how you get there. First, develop your mental models. That is, leaders who understand their world can explain their world. All right? Well, how do you develop mental models? The easy answer is age and experience, right? You know, the older you get, the more sophisticated your mental models become. For example, when you wanted to, you know, get a puppy when you were 5 or 6, how are you asking your parents about wanting a pet? What were you likely to say then, right? I want a pet. I want it now. Get me that pet, right? You would stomp and you would demand it. But by the time you're a teenager, what are you likely doing? Negotiating. Mom and Dad, let me tell you why you need a pet, right? Let me tell you why you need a pet. And so that's because your mental model has shifted, right? You've become more sophisticated. Well, one of the things that we know from studying what's called high reliability organizations, firefighting units, police units, aircraft carriers, is that you can develop your mental models in very particular ways. When you get immersed in particular subject matter, when you have what's called incremental training, just like in athletics, right, as you build skills or build study skills would be another example of that. Engaging in collective learning sessions where you are reluctant to simplify situations and you look for alternative explanations, and also you are preoccupied with failure, not wanting failure, but what you're doing is essentially saying, gee, what could go wrong? How might this unfold in a different way? And collectively you begin to learn new things. And so it's fascinating when you think about some of the research, because let's take your average aircraft carrier, right? That probably has, 5,000 19 or 20-year-olds where planes land and take off 24 hours a day in all kinds of weather. How does that happen? Why are we not hearing about planes dumping into the ocean on a regular basis? Well, that's because they engage in a kind of mass practice where they immerse themselves into their subject matter, they engage in incremental training, they are reluctant to simplify, and they are preoccupied with what could go wrong. So that's one way in which you begin to develop your mental models. And as you think about acquiring content expertise in your areas, that's what you're doing. But you also have to develop skill expertise, and hopefully the communication is a part of that. A second thing that you can do that you might not be aware of is prime for spontaneity. Now, essentially what priming is it takes advantage of the fact that our brains are plastic. Okay, they're muscles. Essentially, they're not hardwired as scientists used to think. But the notion of priming is essentially that conscious recall at one moment leaves an unconscious imprint. For example, somebody asks you about the restaurant that you were at the other night, and you cannot, for the life of you, remember that restaurant's name. You can remember what you had, you can remember who was there, you can remember everything about it, but you cannot remember its name. And then when do you remember the restaurant's name? When do you remember it?
After the conversation.
The next day, you're driving to school, you take a shower, the name just pops up. How does that happen except that you have primed your unconscious, okay, with some sort of conscious trigger or conscious thought, and our unconscious is working and we don't even know it. What brain scientists are telling us is that we vastly underestimate the power of priming. Now, you do it when you practice a golf swing or you engage in speech rehearsal or studying for a test, but you don't understand how much you can be using priming as a way to think about how you're going to handle your week, how you're going to handle that next conversation with someone that will be difficult, how you're going to handle whatever meeting that you're going to be in and you want it to go a certain way. That priming is a way in which you can exert far more control over your communication than you thought. Okay? Martin Alsop, let me give you this example. The first woman to conduct the Boston Symphony Orchestra, and she was having a very bad practice when the great Leonard Bernstein happened to be in the audience, and he took her aside and he said, "This is not going well." He said, "I want you to just forget everything you're doing and just be the music." They took a 5-minute break, she came back, and they played beautifully. And she said just that message by him, which was essentially priming her unconscious, she said it felt like a massage. And so that's what the power of priming can do, is to begin to understand what are the kinds of messages you can be giving yourself that essentially primes your unconscious to help you work in ways that you need to be working. And then a third technique would be using positive emotional contagion. One of the things brain science teaches us these days is that, in fact, we don't just listen with our ears, we listen with our bodies. Does that make sense? Think about it when you're in a room with somebody who's very excited about their subject matter versus somebody who has, say, very flat affect, doesn't move very much, doesn't have much voice variation. It's very hard to sort of map onto that. But if you're with somebody who's excited, where there's enthusiasm, you feel that. You feel, it's hard to articulate, but you feel that. You're not just listening with your ears, you're listening with your body. And so one of the things that we know about framing is that the nonverbal has to go with the verbal, and it has to be in a way that reinforces that. Okay? So emotional contagion is just what that name suggests. There's a contagion or a contagious feeling associated with positive emotions. And one of the things we know is that we have a tendency to mimic the expressions of other people. How many have seen the Office episode where Pam is pregnant and Dwight starts eating a hard-boiled egg? What happens? Pam throws up, and then what is everybody else doing? Yes. They start gagging and throwing up into wastebaskets, right? That's a great example of that mimicking behavior that we have and that function that we have, and we have to understand how that can work in the communication process. High energy framing, therefore, is instrumental to positive emotional contagion. I just have about a few more minutes left, but I want to get into the subject of reframing because this is, I think, terribly important for the day and age in which we live, in which we seem to be such a divided country in so many ways, politically divided in particular. But let's just talk about the conflict that you're likely to encounter whenever you're in a work situation or a school situation. How do we begin to understand how you work through conflict? And let's go back to whether you're an expressive, strategic, or a conventional and how that plays out. One of the things that we know from research is that when there is style agreement, that is, when an expressive is in a fight with another expressive, a conventional with a conventional, a strategic with strategic, that conflict is only over the issues. However, when styles disagree, there's conflict not just over the issues, but that other person's style just bugs the heck out of you. So the expressive, for example, is going to think that the strategic is really manipulative, and the strategic is going to think that the expressive is really rude. And so that means you have to overcome all of those kinds of dynamics in addition to whatever substantive issues there are with respect to the issue at hand. So, we're going to be in conflict situations all the time, and you have to try to figure out how is it that we can begin to work through these various styles. Now, I'm oftentimes asked the question, can you be an expressive and a conventional and a strategic? And the answer is yes, if you're a strategic. That is, a strategic can at times be conventional, can at times be expressive. A conventional can at times be an expressive. An expressive is most likely an expressive. Right? My students ask me, well, my whole family's like this. Could this be a family dynamic? And I think very much that's the case. That there are certain family norms that get established with respect to what you say and what are the norms and boundaries of what you say. And so this is probably one manifestation of that. But what your job is going to be when you're dealing with conflict situations is essentially try to create bridges, not walls. And John Stewart, it's not the John Stewart that you're probably most familiar with, he's a communication scholar, he says, no matter what's happened before, and no matter how bad things currently look, you always have the option to try a next step. No matter how many times the same insult has been repeated, the next step can be creative, rather than retaliatory. No matter how ingrained and toxic the pattern is that groups are caught in, the next move one side makes could be positive. And let me just give you a few examples of that. A couple of years ago, I don't know if you've heard of this situation, Nobel Prize winner Sir Tim Hunt said, let me tell you about my trouble with girls. 3 things happen when they are in the lab. You would fall in love with them, they fall in love with you, and when you criticize them, they cry. this prompted outcry, condemnation, and mirth, including the hashtag distractingly sexy. And look at how the women of science responded. Amelia Cervara said, "Filter masks protect me from hazardous chemicals and muffles my woman cries. Double win, distractingly sexy." And Geeky Girl Engineer said, "Yes, I know I'm distractingly sexy in my hazmat suit. The suit totally flatters my curves." So these are examples of understanding that humor can be quite powerful. Let me talk a little bit about Pope Francis. There's no secret that Pope Francis is having a lot of trouble with some of the conservatives in the Catholic Church. But boy, he made quite a splash. And splash in a way that few popes of recent memory have done, especially when he came out and talked about issues of gay Catholics and gay priests. And the response that he gave was, "Who am I to judge?" Okay. Now, of course, depending on where you are in the political spectrum, this can be problematic. But for a great many individuals, they thought this was self-effacement. This is an inclusive response that brought people into the fold. New York Times columnist Frank Bruni said, "This from a pope is like Streisand saying, 'Who am I to sing?' It's a bit of self-effacement you never saw coming." And why it's so necessary to see these necessary skills with respect to framing and reframing is the Thanksgiving table. How difficult is it for you because of opposite political views? I know from my students and from the folks that I work with and consult with that there's a lot of diversity and opinion out there. And if you've seen the Saturday Night Live Thanksgiving clip, if you haven't seen it, you have to. You'll never listen to Adele the same again because it is one of their funniest. But we have to begin to figure out what are the ways in which we can begin to engage in reframing. And here are some skills that I would ask you to consider. Listen and affirm as much as you are able. I suggest here acknowledge the other person. I hear you, reflect back. But this third one is probably most important. And if you come away with one message from tonight, it's this message: help me understand, right? So rather than challenging or attacking the person who's opposite the political views, help me understand. Help me figure out how you got to the view that you have. Why do you think the way you think? And get to the level of assumptions that they're making or data that they're using, because this is the kind of way in which you can open conversation. Neutralize emotionally charged statements. Boy, as managers, you are going to need this. Okay? Figure out how to essentially absorb the emotion but not reflect that same level of emotion back to them, right? Saying things like, "Gee, I can really see you're upset about this," all right? Learning how to reflect back. Consider mutual gain and shift an either-or argument to a both-and, okay? By a both-and is you've got folks who are presumably have different interests. Can you find ways to satisfy both? It actually takes a great deal more thinking and a higher level of cognitive effort if you can do this, but it is so much more satisfying when you can bring people in rather than choose one over the other. And of course, use humor if playful to disarm and open lines of communication. Build a story file if you have to. If you don't think you have a particularly strong sense of humor, look for funny anecdotes. When you hear someone tell an anecdote, write it down. Create a story file that you can go back to time and again. And the more you reflect on it and look at it and try to repeat it when you're in a group situation, the more it becomes a part of your repertoire. So there are things that you can do, but the key is to try to step back and reflect and bring people together. Not just at Thanksgiving. So let me just end here by saying, do you see the water? Do you see the water?